My name is Mark Saglian, and I am a volunteer here at the Richardson Olmsted campus. We are on the south lawn of the Richardson Olmsted campus of what was originally founded as the Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane. This was an institution that was created for the treatment of persons with mental illness. Ground was broken in 1871 on this institution, and the cornerstone was laid in 1872. It was opened to patients in November of 1880. The elevations of the buildings were designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, and the style that was used is Richardsonian Romanesque. It is a form of architecture that Richardson was responsible for creating. So the buildings themselves are constructed of what was referred to as red Medina sandstone. That sandstone was transported here on the Erie Canal in giant slabs, and each one of these individual stones was chipped and fitted into place on site. It took 10 years for this institution, for the East Wing and the Towers building to be created and to be open for patients. It would take another 10 years before ground would be broken on the West Wing of the hospital. You'll notice that the buildings themselves are characterized by gables and towers and turrets and these archways, almost Romanesque archways. Those were the qualities or the characteristics of Richardsonian Romanesque. Richardson himself was very young when he gained this commission. He was in his 30s. This was his first major commission, and actually created this campus along with Frederick Olmsted, his friend and neighbor from Staten Island, who is the father of landscape architecture. So we're standing at the north entrance of the former Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane, which had been converted to a hotel. This north entrance, you'll see the glass vestibule in front of us. It replaced a brick addition that had been added to the hospital in 1918. The hotel itself, it originally opened as the Hotel Henry, named after Henry Hobson Richardson, the architect, in 2015. Unfortunately, when COVID hit, the events dried up, weddings, conferences, things like that, and their cash flow was obviously affected, and the hotel had to close, and it closed in 2020. So we're standing now looking through what was referred to as the subway for the Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane. The complex itself was based on the Kirkbride model, and it essentially stretches a half mile from end to end. Obviously, when vendors came to make deliveries, it was far easier for them to move carriages and wagons and things through the building itself as opposed to around the other end of the building. So they created these subways, were part of Henry Hobson Richardson's design. And these subways essentially allowed for the passage of goods, products and things from one side of the building to the other. We're standing on the north side now. The main entrance is on the south side of the building, and so it would have been necessary for vendors to be able to move goods and provide services through the building, through this subway. One of the hallmarks of Richardsonian Romanesque architecture are the archways, and you can see that in a lot of the design, the towers, of the building itself, and these Romanesque kind of archways. So this institution was constructed on what was referred to as the Kirkbride Plan. The Kirkbride Plan was envisioned by a Philadelphia physician named Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride. It's essentially what was referred to as a linear model. Linear models for institutions for persons with mental illness were characterized by central administrative buildings, in our case, the Towers building, and buildings on either side of the Towers or administrative building. In this case, our buildings run from east to west. In the Kirkbride Plan, typically the most disturbed patients within the institution would have been admitted to the wing buildings furthest away from the Towers building, with the belief being that as patients gradually improved, they would move from one building to the next until they were able to be discharged right out of the front doors of the central administrative building. We're standing in the south side of the Richardson Olmsted campus before the grand entranceway for the former Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane. You'll notice the three archway entrance, very typical of Richardsonian architectural design. Inside these archways, you'll see that there's mint and tile on the outside. That design motif actually is incorporated in some of the interior design on the east wing of the buildings. This would have been the entrance that patients entered when they entered the institution for treatment, and it's also the very entrance that they would have exited when they were released as cured. Okay, we're inside what would have been the main entranceway of the administrative building, or the central towers building of the Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane. This building itself housed the families of the medical staff themselves, the doctors. The superintendent of the institution lived with his family on the second floor. This particular floor had a parlor for the reception of visitors. An apothecary or the pharmacy was located on this floor. The steward's office was located on this floor, and the superintendent's medical office and private office were located on this floor as well. So when visitors would have entered the institution for the first time, they would have been met by this grand staircase. In 1880, when the institution opened to patients for the first time, this staircase was double its size, and it was located in the middle of this space. Over time, the staircase around 1900 was essentially divided in half and moved to the left side of this entrance space to allow for the infusion of more natural light in the space itself. The staircase is constructed of a number of different kinds of wood: mahogany, cherry, oak as well. This is, in fact, the original staircase. These decorative plaster corbels were a part of Richardson's original design. Essentially, corbels are load-bearing. They help to support the weight of the floor above. These are more, however, likely more ornamental. In terms of the design motif itself, you see design reminiscent of oak clusters, and actually some French influence, I think, in these corbels as well. I think it's interesting to note that Richardson trained in architecture in Paris. So here on the second floor of the towers or administrative building, you see an example of the original design motif within the building itself. This is hand stenciling that was part of the original design. In the second building on the east wing, there's a signature up in the attic, and it's a signature of a gentleman named Eugene Melancon, who was working in his father's fresco business. They were doing the contracting work here, the hand stenciling. He essentially signed his canvas in the attic on the second building on the east wing. He was responsible, one of the individuals responsible for hand stenciling this design motif throughout the various buildings from one end to the other. So we are still standing on the second floor of the Towers building. This space became the reception area for the original Hotel Henry when it operated. The check-in area, it was located on this floor. Personal spaces, private spaces for parties and banquets and things like that also existed on this floor as well. Originally, this space actually was occupied by the family of the superintendent. If you look up, you'll see the original configuration of the staircase, the underside of the central or grand staircase in the building. Originally, the wide staircase was in the center, and then two narrower staircases on either side, but you can actually see, the original design above us. We're now standing on the fourth floor of the Towers building. This room originally would have functioned as the institution's chapel and entertainment space for patients. Originally, this room had an altar on one end and a stage on the other. When the Hotel Henry opened for operation, this grand space was converted to the ballroom, and banquets and receptions and other events were held in this obviously very large space. So the towers themselves are purely ornamental. They were designed by Richardson to be ornamental. There are a series of platforms within the towers themselves. The towers now house some of the air conditioning units and the climate control, but in the earlier days in the 1880s and 1900s, these towers essentially would have been empty. So we're standing now in the connector between the administrative or Towers building and the first ward building on the east wing of the former Buffalo State Asylum. The design in this connector here, you'll notice the floor is Minton tile. Minton tile is a ceramic tile that was imported from England. It was very popular in churches and monasteries in the early 1800s. It began to be incorporated throughout Victorian architecture in the 1800s, the 1880s, really up until the 1900s. It's durable, it's inexpensive, it's colorful, and it is part of the original design motif as envisioned by H. Richardson when he designed the asylum here in Buffalo. So we're standing in the first ward building on the east wing of the hospital. This corridor was referred to at the time as the patient's day room. The corridor itself is 210 feet long, 16 feet wide, and 16 feet high. The corridor itself is single loaded, which means essentially that there were rooms on the north side of the corridor or the left-hand side of the corridor and not the right-hand side of the corridor. The reason for that is that in the design plan for Thomas Story Kirkbride, the idea was to maximize the amount of light and fresh air and natural ventilation that entered into the institution. So, that having been said, single-loaded corridors allowed for windows along the south side of the buildings, the south side of the corridor itself, to allow for more natural light into the space. And you can see that here in the space. Okay, so we're standing now in a typical patient room. This room has obviously been restored, but this is essentially an 8 by 9 square foot room that a patient would have occupied. The patient would have had a bed, a chest of drawers. They would have been permitted to decorate it in any way that they would have liked with anything that they would have brought with them from home. Typically, one patient would have occupied this room. As the hospital became more and more overcrowded, you might see as many as 2 beds in a room this size. The rooms, as the corridors, are typified by 16-foot high ceilings and a lot of natural light, which they believed, and ventilation, which they believed was conducive to the recovery of patients with mental illness. We're standing now in a typical hotel room here in the rehabilitated space at the Richardson Olmsted campus. Because this is a National Historic Landmark, there aren't a lot of changes that can be made to the structure of the buildings themselves. So what you essentially see here is a combination of multiple patient rooms to create one hotel room. There are bump outs in the corridors that allowed for the placement of plumbing for the restrooms, the bathrooms in the hotel rooms themselves. Those were not part of the original design of the hospital or the institution, but you do see those evidenced in the corridor. We are on the 4th floor of the first building on the west wing of the former asylum. The 4th floor is essentially the attic of the building, and what you see here are some of the rafters that were incorporated in the design for the suite level of the former Hotel Henry. So this is a typical suite on the 4th floor of the former Hotel Henry. You can see that there are multi-levels in this space. You know, this was a premium hotel room, and the view of the city of Buffalo out the windows from this floor is just breathtaking. We're standing in the second building on the east wing of the old Buffalo State Asylum. What you're seeing is what happens to an abandoned building after 40 plus years of lack of climate control and ventilation and everything else. So you notice plaster falling off of the walls, plaster on the floors, paint peeling off of the walls. This is essentially what happens when you neglect a space like this for a prolonged period of time. Again, single-loaded corridor, windows on the right-hand side of the corridor or the south side of the building, patient rooms on the north side of the building or the left-hand side of this corridor. I'd like to thank you for joining us on this virtual tour of the Richardson Olmsted campus here in Buffalo, New York. We've appreciated having you along for this exploration of the architecture of Henry Hobson Richardson and Frederick Law Olmsted. And we're very proud to be able to tell the story of the preservation and reuse of this space, of the medical history of this space, and the importance that it played in the history of Western New York. Thank you.